Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we will discuss the articles displayed on the screen from the Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 28th March 2019. So let's start our discussion. This article on page number 1 is related to the successful testing of the anti-satellite missile system, which is also known as Mission Shakti. Now this is an important event in the space program of India because it has now become a space power. And that is why it also becomes important for us from the exam point of view. So if you see the syllabus, you will find that it will fall under the General Studies paper 3 under the topic technology and particularly related to space technology. Now if you go through the previous year questions, you will find that in the year 2016 in the preliminary examination, there was a question related to another landmark event of India's space program. And in that year, the Mangal was launched. So the question that was asked in the preliminary examination of 2016 was related to the Mangal mission. So before getting into the details of this article, let us try to solve that question in order to understand what kind of question can be asked related to this mission of India. So the question reads, consider the following statements. The Mangal launched by ISRO, the first statement is also called the Mars Orbiter mission. Now this statement was correct. The second statement reads, it made India the second country to have a spacecraft orbit the Mars after USA. Now this statement is incorrect because India was not the second country to orbit the Mars. And before India, the US, China and Russia have already successfully done their Mars missions. The third statement reads, it made India the only country to be successful in making its spacecraft orbit the Mars in its very first attempt. Now this was a unique feature of India's Mars mission and that is why it appeared in the exam also. So here also you should note that the India successfully tested its anti-satellite missile system in its first attempt only. So the correct answer here was C, that is 1 and 3 are correct. So in this article also, let us try to understand how many countries before India have tested this anti-satellite missile system and various other important aspects of this test by India. So first let us start with what is meant by an anti-satellite missile system and what are the objectives of the Mission Shakti. So simply it is called as ASAT or the anti-satellite missile test, and it is the technological capability to hit and destroy the satellites in space through the missiles which are launched from the ground. So it should be noted that it provides the capability to hit and destroy satellites in the space, and this is done by missiles which are launched from the ground. So as you can see in this infograph, this test was carried under the Mission Shakti. Further, where was the target missile located? So this target missile was hit in the low Earth orbit at about 300 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And regarding this ASAT, you should also note that it is a modified interceptor missile of the ballistic missile defense system that is being developed by India. So it is a part of that. How much time did this mission take? So it took only 3 minutes. Further, why was the low Earth orbit chosen? So regarding this, you should note that it was chosen in order to minimize the debris which are created by such tests. So which other countries have the capability to hit the satellites in the space through a missile launched from the ground? So the countries include the United States of America, Russia and China. And now India has also joined this club. So this means that there are only 4 countries in the world which have the capability to hit a satellite in the space through a missile which is launched from the ground. Now, which satellite was hit during this test? So the name of the satellite is also important, and you should note that the name of the satellite was MicroSat-R, and it is an imaging satellite, and it used to orbit at about 274 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Now, what are the objectives of this mission? So the first objective was that it is aimed at destroying, if necessary, the satellites which are owned by the enemy countries. Now, why are these satellites which are owned by the enemy countries important? So here it should be noted that satellites are extremely critical infrastructure of any country these days. And a large number of crucial applications like the navigation systems, communication networks, broadcasting, the banking systems, stock markets, etc. all are dependent on the communication through the satellites. So by destroying the satellites, it would render the satellites of other countries useless. And by doing this, the enemy infrastructure can be crippled and could be brought down on knees, and that too without causing any threat to human lives. So this means that in case of a war, it becomes important defense system for India, and in this case, it can cripple the enemy infrastructure to have an advantage in any warlike situation. Now, in what manner was the satellite hit by the missile? So, did it use any explosives or the ammunitions? So, regarding this, you should note that this strike was a kinetic kill strike. And in such kind of strike, the kinetic energy which is derived from the fast movement of the target is used to destroy the target. And this means that there is no use of explosives or ammunitions. So, it simply means that it utilizes the speed of the target itself in destroying the target. So that is why this strike did not use any explosives or ammunitions. And as can be seen in this map, only United States, the USSR and the China had the capability of hitting a satellite in the space. And after this test, India has also joined this elite club. Now, after going through the objectives and the key aspects of this anti-satellite test, let us look at some other problems or issues associated with this mission of India. And we will cover these aspects in the question-answer format. So the first question that arises is that why only a few countries have such a system or such an anti-satellite missile system? So the first reason for this is that it requires advanced capabilities both in space and missile technologies. And in this line, not many countries possess such kind of capabilities. And that is why there are only 4 countries in the world which have this capability. Secondly, almost every country is against the weaponization of space. And that is why not many countries are interested in such kind of tests. For example, Israel has the capability of conducting such kind of tests. However, it has not shown the intention of doing so. Thirdly, there are international treaties which govern the use of space. And these treaties mandate that the outer space and the celestial bodies like moon must only be exploited for peaceful purposes. So that is why not many countries are participating in such kind of missions. And finally, such kind of tests or missions create the problem of space debris. So later in this article, we will try to discuss what are the international treaties which govern the use of space and what is the problem of space debris. Now before that, let us understand why did India conduct this test? So in this line, the Ministry of External Affairs has given its rationale for conducting such kind of test at this point of time. So the arguments provided by the Ministry of External Affairs are that India has a long-standing and rapidly growing space program. In this line, you should note that India's space program has expanded rapidly in the last 5 years. And important missions of India in the space include the Mangalyaan mission to Mars and also the Gaganyaan mission, which will take Indians to the outer space or the human beings to the outer space. Further, India has undertaken 102 spacecraft missions, which consist of communication satellites, Earth observation satellites, experimental satellites, navigation satellites, etc. And that is why India's space program is critical backbone of India's security, economic and social infrastructure. So due to all these reasons, the test was done to verify that India has the capability to safeguard its space assets. And it is the government of India's responsibility to defend the country's interest in the outer space. So simply this test was conducted in order to safeguard the satellites which India has launched in the space, and these satellites are critical backbone of India's security, economic and social infrastructure. Now, although India has claimed that such kind of test is only intended for peaceful purposes and also to protect its own satellites, questions have been raised regarding India entering an arms race in the outer space. So let us look at this question: is India entering into an arms race in the outer space? So in this regard, the Ministry of External Affairs has provided the justification regarding this question. So the first justification is that India has no intention of entering into an arms race in the outer space. And regarding this, India has always maintained that space must be used only for peaceful purposes. Also, India is against the weaponization of outer space and supports all international efforts to reinforce the safety and security of space-based assets. Further, India believes that the outer space is the common heritage of mankind, and it is the responsibility of all spacefaring nations to preserve, promote the benefits flowing from the advances made in the space technology and its application for all. So India believes that the outer space is a common heritage of all the humankind, and that is why it should be used for the benefits of all the other countries as well. And that is why India does not encourage an arms race in the outer space, and also does not have any intention of entering an arms race in this space. Thirdly, India is a party to all the major international treaties relating to the outer space. So in the next slide, we'll be looking at what are the important international treaties which govern the outer space. Fourthly, India already implements a number of transparency and confidence building measures regarding the operation and use of the space. Further, India has been participating in all sessions of the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Further, India supports the prevention of an arms race in the outer space, and this has been India's stand on the agenda since 1982. So all these aspects show that India does not have any intention of entering an arms race in the outer space. And these are the justifications which have been provided by Ministry of External Affairs. So now what is the international law on weapons in the outer space? And how does India fare on the compliance with such international law? So regarding this, you should note that the most important or the principal treaty regarding the weapons in the space is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And you should note that India is a signatory to this treaty and has ratified it in 1982. And this treaty prohibits only the weapons of mass destruction in the outer space and not the use of ordinary weapons. So in this line, India has not been using weapons of mass destruction in the outer space and does not intend to do so. And regarding the compliance of India with this international law, India has stated that it expects to play a role in the future in drafting of international law on prevention of arms race in the outer space and also prevention of placement of weapons in the outer space. Further, India is not in violation of any international law or treaty to which it is a party or any national obligation. So this means that India has already been complying with the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 and it has ratified this treaty in 1982. Also, further, India intends to play a major role in drafting of an international law on the prevention of an arms race in the outer space. And presently, India is not in violation of any international treaty, and you should note that this treaty prohibits the use of only weapons of mass destruction in the outer space and not the use of ordinary weapons. Now also, questions have been raised regarding this test that it was directed against a particular country. So in this regard, India has clarified that this test was not directed against any country. And in this line, India's space capabilities do not threaten any country and nor are they directed against anyone. However, these tests were conducted because the government is committed to ensuring the country's national security interest and is also alert to the threats from emerging technologies. And that is why, to improve the national security interests, India has conducted this test. Further, this anti-satellite missile test provides credible deterrence against any threat to the satellites of India in the space. And presently, many countries are developing long-range missiles and there has been a proliferation in the types and number of missiles. So in order to secure India's space-based assets, India has conducted this anti-satellite missile test. And this test provides credible deterrence or safety to the assets of India in this space. Now another issue which is associated with such kind of tests or the anti-satellite tests is that it creates huge amount of space debris or space trash. So now let us understand why is space debris such a big problem. So regarding this, you should note that any satellite or anything which is launched in the space will remain in space almost forever unless it is specifically brought down or it slowly disintegrates over decades or centuries. And regarding the satellites, you should note that they have a particular time period for their functioning. And after they have completed their life, they are no longer required to remain in the space. Now, although such satellites which have completed their lifetime are not required to be in the space, but they keep on orbiting aimlessly in some orbit. And that is why such useless satellites or the satellites which are not useful anymore keep orbiting in the space, and these satellites have been termed as space debris. Further, in such anti-satellite missile tests, if a satellite is destroyed, it disintegrates into very small pieces, and these small pieces add to the space debris. So the threat is that these space debris could collide with operational satellites and can make them dysfunctional. So this space debris problem is similar to the garbage that is generated on the surface of Earth, and it renders the operational satellites useless in this space. This is because by collision, it can change the track of these satellites or damage the operational satellites. So that is why these space debris are a problem, and these anti-satellite missile tests are known to create small pieces due to the disintegration of satellites, and these small pieces add to the space debris. So an associated concept with the space debris is the Kessler syndrome. And this Kessler syndrome was first proposed by the NASA's scientist Donald J. Kessler in 1978. So now this Kessler syndrome is a scenario in which the density of objects in the low Earth orbit is high enough. And due to this high density of objects in the low Earth orbit, there can be collisions between these objects. And these collisions could cause a cascading whereby each collision generates space debris that increases the likelihood of further collisions. So this simply means that when the density of objects in the low Earth orbit are high enough, there will be multiple collisions between these objects. Now these objects will further create space debris, and these space debris will further collide with other objects which are present in the low Earth orbit. And such a process will be difficult to control and will go on continuously. So now what is the likely implication or consequences of such a scenario in which the number of space debris keep on increasing by such collisions? So one such implication is that such huge amount of space debris will render the space useless, and it would become impractical and difficult for the satellites to operate from specific orbital ranges. So a consequence is that the huge increase in the space debris could render the space useless, and no satellite will be able to function smoothly because of such collisions which are created by the increase in huge amount of space debris. And this phenomena has been known as the Kessler syndrome. So this can be an important aspect for us from preliminary examination as well. Now, as we have learned in this article that India has hit a satellite which was orbiting in the low Earth orbit. So it becomes important for us to know about what is meant by the low Earth orbit. So regarding the low Earth orbit, you should note that it is an orbit with an altitude of 2000 kilometers or 1200 miles. And this is approximately 1/3 of the radius of Earth. And an important aspect of this low Earth orbit is that most of the man-made objects or the satellites in the space are in this low Earth orbit. So this should be kept in mind, and this can also be an important aspect for us from preliminary examination point of view. Now the question arises, does the India's test create space debris? So yes, it also created some space debris. However, the exact amount is not measurable at this point. Further, in this regard, the Ministry of External Affairs has clarified that this test was done in the lower atmosphere to ensure that there is no space debris. And if these debris are generated, they will decay and fall back into the Earth within weeks. This means that there will be no space debris left after this test. Now, why will there be less space debris? This is because the India satellite which was hit by the missile was orbiting at 300 kilometers. And this was very close to Earth. And in this case, if the debris are generated, they will either decay or fall back onto the Earth. Now, when China conducted a similar test in 2007, it had targeted a satellite which was placed more than 800 kilometers from the Earth's surface. And the debris which were created by this test would remain in the space for several decades and possibly for several centuries. That is why this test of China was criticized. However, India has stated that it has conducted a test very close to the atmosphere, and in case space debris are created, they will fall back on Earth or they will be decaying or destroyed. Now, as these anti-satellite missile systems are known to create space debris, let us understand what are the other ways to target enemy satellites which do not generate any space debris. So in this regard, many countries have explored the alternative options of making the enemy satellites dysfunctional. And these other ways or other techniques do not involve destruction of the target or the target satellites, and also they do not lead to the creation of space debris. So first such technology is to jam the communication from the satellites, and this can be done by interfering into the radio signals which are sent by the satellites. So by jamming such radio signals and jamming the communication from the satellites, they can be rendered useless. And that is how a country can target the enemy satellites. The second technique is the close proximity anti-satellite technologies. And this technology involves the possibility of sending satellites that could just approach a target close enough, and this will lead to the deviation of the satellite from its selected orbit. And this can be done without destroying the satellite. So this means that a satellite is launched in the space, and this reaches close enough to the target satellite and changes its orbit. So by changing the orbit, the original use or the functionality of the satellite is disrupted. And that is how the enemy satellite can be targeted. And the third option available is the use of ground-based lasers. And these lasers can impact or disrupt the sensors of the satellite and make these satellites partially blind. And that is why they become unable to work efficiently. So these are some other ways in which the enemy satellites can be targeted. So in this article, we have learned about the various aspects of the mission Shakti of India. Secondly, we have learned why only a few countries have such an anti-satellite missile system, and also why India conducted the test in the first place. Further, we have addressed the question of India entering into an arms race in the outer space, and also what is the international law on weapons in the outer space. Further, we looked at the intention of the mission Shakti, and also that it was not directed against any other country. And this test was conducted in order to create a credible deterrence against threats to its satellites. Further, we learned about the problem of space debris and the Kessler syndrome. Also, what is meant by the term low Earth orbit, and how will India's mission Shakti not lead to the formation of space debris. And finally, we have looked at the other ways in which the enemy satellites can be targeted. Now, after this discussion, you should try and answer these questions from your mains examination point of view. And with this, let's move to the next article. Now, in this article on page number 1, the Election Commission of India has told the Supreme Court that the introduction of electoral bonds will affect the transparency in the election funding process. So this will form a part of the General Studies paper 2 under the topic Polity. Now, in this, let us take up what are the points or what are the submissions of the Election Commission of India in the Supreme Court regarding the electoral bonds. Also, what are the issues related to the electoral bonds in India. And if you look at the previous year mains questions of the paper 2, you will find that there was a question in the year 2017 related to the suggestions or the proposed electoral reforms by the Election Commission of India. So that is why the issue of electoral bonds is also important, and it has not appeared in the paper till now. So it can be a potential question for your coming mains examination. Now, for the introduction of electoral bonds in India, changes were made in the following acts. And these changes were done in the Finance Act, which is presented with the budget in the year 2016, as well as in the Finance Act of 2017. In the Finance Act of 2016, the changes were made in the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act of 2010. And further, changes were also made in the Income Tax Act of 1961, the Representation of People Act 1951, the Companies Act of 2013, and the Reserve Bank of India Act 1934. So you should keep this aspect in mind that the changes were made in the following acts for the introduction of electoral bonds. And this can be a potential question for your preliminary examination. Now let us look at the impact of introduction of electoral bonds and what are the associated issues with these electoral bonds in India. Now, before the introduction of electoral bonds, donations to the political parties could be done in cash below the amount of rupees 20,000. However, after the introduction of electoral bonds, this amount was reduced only to 2,000. And now all the donations above rupees 2,000 cannot be done in cash, and they have to be done through the electoral bonds. Now, previously, the political parties had to declare donations in excess of rupees 2,000 received from any person or company. So these political parties had to declare the donations which were in excess of rupees 20,000 before the introduction of electoral bonds. Also, the political parties were supposed to maintain the records of contributions which were made in excess of rupees 20,000 with the names and addresses of all the donors. However, after the introduction of electoral bonds through the Finance Act of 2017, the donor is not required to disclose the name of the political party while purchasing the electoral bonds. And the political parties are not required to maintain the records of these donors. Now, this is one of the issues with the introduction of electoral bonds, because previously all the donations above rupees 20,000 had to be maintained by the political parties as to where it is coming from, and the name and address of the donating company or the corporate. However, now this provision has been done away with, and this affects the cause of transparency in the funding of elections. This is because the names of the company which are donating to particular political parties is not being given out. Now, previously under the Companies Act of 2013, a company had to be at least 3 years old in order to contribute to a political party, and its contribution could not have been more than 7.5% of its average net profit in the 3 preceding years. So this was the provision in the Companies Act before the electoral bonds were introduced. However, with the introduction of electoral bonds and the amendment in the Companies Act 2013, the government has removed the cap of 7.5% on political donations by the company. Secondly, now the companies need not disclose the name of political party to which the company has contributed. So now what is the issue with these amendments and the introduction of electoral bonds and the changes in the Companies Act? Now any company can donate any amount of cash through the electoral bonds, and the identity of such company shall not be disclosed. So that is why shell companies can be formed by these companies just for political funding, and this can be a major source of corruption. So the first issue was related to the anonymity and transparency, while the second is related to the shell companies and the source of corruption in political funding. So these are two major issues. The third major issue is related to the foreign contribution or foreign funding of the political parties. Now regarding foreign funding, you should note that previously under the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, the foreign funding or all the funding from the foreign sources was not allowed to the political parties. However, now with the introduction of electoral bonds and the changes in the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, it has been allowed that the donations can be received from foreign companies which have a majority stake in Indian companies. And this could only be done if the foreign companies were following the FEMA guidelines and which are related to the foreign investment in the sectors in which they operate. So by the changes in the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, now the foreign funding for the political parties is also open. And this can also lead to a corruption and influencing of the policy decisions in India. So the three major issues are related to transparency, corruption and the foreign funding. Now let us look at the submission of the Election Commission of India in the Supreme Court regarding the electoral bonds. Now as we have learned about the various issues related or associated with the electoral bonds, the Election Commission of India has submitted in the Supreme Court that the introduction of electoral bonds and the way in which they have been introduced causes a serious impact on the transparency in political funding. This is because the companies are not required to disclose their names and the names of the political parties to which they are funding. Secondly, by allowing the foreign funding through the purchase of electoral bonds, these kinds of funding invite foreign corporate powers into Indian politics. So this can also lead to interference in the Indian politics. This is because the foreign companies can now invest in the political parties. Further, the Election Commission of India also raised concerns on the two consecutive amendments which were made in the Finance Acts of 2016 and 17. And we have learned that these amendments were related to changes in the Income Tax Act, the Representation of People Act 1951, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act of 2010, etc. And regarding these amendments, the Election Commission has said that these amendments would pump in black money for political parties through the shell companies. And this will also allow unchecked foreign funding of political parties in India, which could lead to Indian politics being influenced by the foreign companies. The Election Commission has also said that it had warned the Ministry of Law and Justice about the amendments and the adverse impact these could have on the political funding in India. Now this matter is sub judice and the Supreme Court is yet to take a decision or give a verdict on this issue. Now this petition has been filed in the Supreme Court by the Association for Democratic Rights or ADR, and they have raised the issue of unlimited corporate funding and transparency in political funding. So after going through this discussion, you should try and answer this question from your mains examination point of view. With this, let's move to the next article. Now this article on page number 13 is in news because India and the United States have signed an agreement for exchange of country by country reports. And this has been signed in order to give a huge relief to the subsidiaries of the US headquarters companies in taxation related matters. Now, this agreement was a part of the action plan which was adopted by the OECD countries. And this action plan by the OECD was planned in order to mitigate the risks which were originating from base erosion and profit shifting. And in this case, you should note that India is an active participant of this project. So this shall fall under General Studies Paper 3 in the topic Economic Development. And as you can see in this question in the 2016, the term base erosion and profit shifting was in news. And the question asked us to identify in what context was the term base erosion and profit shifting was in news. So in this article, let us try to understand what is meant by this term base erosion and profit shifting. Also, what are the important tools of base erosion and profit shifting? For example, double taxation avoidance agreements, misuse of these agreements, treaty shopping, round tripping, and transfer mispricing. So now what is meant by this term base erosion and profit shifting? So it simply refers to the tax avoidance strategy in which the companies take undue advantage of the tax exemptions in order to reduce their tax burdens. So this term base erosion and profit shifting generally or simply refers to the tax avoidance strategy which is adopted by various countries to take undue advantage of tax exemptions that have been provided in various countries. So this term base erosion and profit shifting means that companies, in order to reduce their tax burdens, simply shift from high tax countries to low tax countries. And in this process, what they do is that they erode the taxation base of the high tax jurisdiction countries and they try to shift their profits to those countries which have low taxation systems. So in this case, the MNCs try to avoid the taxation in the high tax countries. And also, by shifting to low tax jurisdictions, they avoid their taxation burdens. So under this tax avoidance strategy, the MNCs shift their profits from high tax jurisdictions to low tax jurisdictions. And these low tax jurisdictions are known as tax havens. And they do so in order to pay less tax. So this leads to erosion of tax base for high tax countries. And a report published by the OECD or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development stated that the base erosion and profit shifting is responsible for the tax losses of around $200 billion globally. So let us try to understand what are the important tools of base erosion and profit shifting. So the important tools of BEPS include double taxation avoidance agreements or the misuse of these agreements. Secondly, treaty shopping. Thirdly, round tripping. And finally, transfer mispricing. So by all these methods, the MNCs try to avoid paying tax. And due to this, it is causing great amount of losses to countries which have high tax jurisdictions. So let us understand these strategies of tax avoidance which are adopted by MNCs one by one. So now let us understand the term double taxation avoidance agreement and how it is misused by MNCs to avoid paying taxes. So regarding this double taxation agreement, you should note that it is signed between two or more countries. And its objective is that taxpayers in these countries can avoid being taxed twice for the same income. Now, for example, there are two countries A and B. And if an MNC by the name X, which is registered in country A, does a business in country B and earns the profit from its operation in the country B, it will be taxed twice in both these countries. This is because it is registered in country A, however, it is earning profits in country B. So this MNC during normal circumstances will be taxed twice. And in such a situation, it will have to pay taxes in the country B as well as country A. So the key objective of the DTA agreement is that the taxpayers in these countries can avoid being taxed twice for the same income. So as we have seen in this example, the company X during normal circumstances will be taxed twice in both the countries. However, if there is a double taxation agreement between the country A and B, this company X will not have to pay the taxation twice and will only have to pay the tax once. So either this company X will pay the tax in B country or in the A country. So these double taxation avoidance agreements are intended to make a country an attractive investment destination by providing relief on dual taxation. So you should understand that such kind of agreements are signed in order to attract the foreign direct investment in such countries. This is because if an MNC or a company will be taxed twice, it will not find it attractive to invest in the other country. So in majority of the cases, the country has to pay taxes in the country in which it is registered. Now, how this double taxation avoidance agreement is misused. So let us take up the example of India. And in India's case, India has signed this double taxation avoidance treaty with Mauritius, Cayman Island, etc. So in case of India, if a company which is registered in Mauritius or Cayman Island will not have to pay taxes in India, but will have to pay taxes in the country in which they are registered. So for example, if a company Y is registered in Mauritius, it will not have to pay taxes in India under the double taxation avoidance agreement. So what the multinational companies do is that they create or register shell companies in these low taxation countries. And here you should note that these countries are generally low tax countries. So what multinational companies do is that they register a shell company in these low taxation countries, and from there on they invest in countries like India. So in such a scenario, the MNCs avoid paying taxes in both Mauritius as well as in India. This is because Mauritius already has a low taxation system, and also India is not charging taxes under the DTAA treaty or the agreement. So this phenomenon leads to base erosion in India or the tax base erosion in India. And this is done by shifting the profit to Mauritius or Cayman Island because it is registered in that low tax jurisdiction. Now another related term is the treaty shopping. And under this treaty shopping, the foreign company routes its investment into India through a tax haven or a low tax country. And under this treaty shopping, a foreign company routes its investment into India through a tax haven country or a low tax jurisdiction country. And it does so by registering a company headquartered in the tax haven and then establishes its Indian subsidiary to carry out operations. For example, the Vodafone's operation in India were routed through the Cayman Island. Although the company is not based in Cayman Island, it registered a shell company in Cayman Island, and from there on it invested in India. And by doing so, it avoided paying taxes in India, and also it benefited because it was located in a low tax country or a tax haven like Cayman Island. So by misusing these agreements and treaty shopping, these companies try to avoid paying taxes, and these leads to huge losses for countries where the companies are earning profits. Now the details of these double taxation avoidance agreements and treaty shopping are provided in your PDF. So please go through them. Another method of base erosion and profit shifting is a term known as round tripping. Now to understand the concept of round tripping, let us take the example of India and the tax haven countries like Mauritius and Cayman Island. Now regarding this, you should note that if India has high taxes and these tax haven countries like Mauritius and Cayman Island have low taxes. Now in this scenario, a company which is registered in India and belongs to India opens up a shell company in the tax haven. And through this shell company, it again invests into India. Now as this mother company registers a shell company in the low tax country or the tax haven countries, it tries to avoid paying taxes in India. This is because the shell company is registered in the tax havens. And this process has been termed as round tripping. This is because in this process, the capital moves from high taxation country to low taxation countries and from low taxation country again to the high taxation country. And this process is followed by MNCs or companies simply in order to avoid or bypass the high taxation system of the mother country where it is operating. So as you can see in this definition, it refers to a practice where the capital belonging to India goes out to a tax haven country where it is used to set up a shell company, and the money is then reinvested back in India in the form of FDI. And the profit out of such investment cannot be taxed in India as the capital is coming from a tax haven. So simply this leads to loss of taxes in India. And that is why this is also a technique of base erosion and profit shifting. Now the third method which is used for base erosion and profit shifting is known as transfer mispricing. Now what is meant by the term transfer price? So here you should note that it refers to the price at which the parent or the subsidiary company sells its goods and services to another subsidiary company. For example, if there is a parent company which is located in India, and if this parent company sells its product to a subsidiary company, this pricing is known as transfer pricing. Now, as we know that India has high taxation and the tax havens will have a low taxation. Now, what these companies do in mispricing is that the parent company, which is located in India, sells to its subsidiary, which is located in a tax haven, at a very high price. And by doing this, the cost of the company or the operating cost of the company, which is located in India, becomes high. Now, as the operating cost becomes high, it can show that its profit has decreased considerably. So by pricing the product for a subsidiary company at a high price, what the parent company does is that it increases or shows its operating costs as high. And by doing so, it shows that its profit has decreased. Now, as the profit has decreased, the tax burden on the parent company also decreases. And that is how the companies avoid paying higher taxes in countries with high tax jurisdiction. So this is also one of the techniques used for base erosion and profit shifting. So now what this agreement between India and USA does. Now earlier there was filing of country by country report by the multinational enterprises, and this was seen as placing a huge compliance burden on the subsidiary enterprises of these multinational enterprises. Now what this agreement tries to do is that it will enable both the countries to automatically exchange the country by country reports filed by ultimate parent entities. So this simply means that the current agreement requires the parent company to automatically exchange the country by country reports. However, before this agreement, the subsidiary companies also had to fulfill or present the country by country report, and which generally increased the compliance burden and was not seen as a sign of ease of doing business. So now, as you can see in the 2016's question, the term base erosion and profit shifting is sometimes seen in the news in the context of. So the correct answer was that curbing of tax evasion by multinational companies. And we have seen that these multinational companies deploy various methods to avoid tax. And with this, let's move to the next article. Now, this article on page number 9 is related to the none of the above option in the elections. Now, as the Lok Sabha elections have been recently announced, we have seen various articles in the newspaper related to first past the post system, and also related to proportional representation system and delimitation. So similarly, this is in continuation with that series, and now it brings up the issue of none of the above option in the elections. So this will be another important topic for us from General Studies paper 2 under the topic Polity. Now the none of the above option or the NOTA option was included in the Indian election system by the Election Commission of India after the Supreme Court's judgment in the People's Union for Civil Liberties versus Union of India case in 2013. However, the none of the above option does not provide for right to reject. So now let us understand why was the NOTA introduced in the first place. So the Supreme Court contended that it gives the voters the option not to vote for any candidates in the election. So it can be said to be a negative vote on the candidates which have been proposed to be elected. Secondly, the significant votes for NOTA signify that the voters do not prefer any of the candidates fielded by various political parties. So to provide the freedom to the electors for rejecting all the candidates which are fielded by the political parties, the Supreme Court in 2013 allowed for the introduction of NOTA in the elections. The Supreme Court further contended that it would give the people the option to reject, which will make political parties field better candidates in elections. Now let us look at the problems associated with the NOTA. Now, some of the problems associated with the NOTA is that it does not amount to right to rejection in the elections, which means that in case NOTA secures the highest number of votes, it does not lead to the rejection of other candidates which have been fielded by the political parties. And under the first past the post system, as we have learned that the candidate who secures the highest number of votes is declared as the winner. Now, in case NOTA secures the highest number of votes, even then, the person who has secured the next highest number of votes is declared as the winner. So let us take up an example. For example, if A candidate secures 30 votes, B secures 20 votes, and the NOTA option secures 50 votes, in such a scenario, the candidate A will be declared as the winner because the NOTA does not signify any political candidate, and also it has not been provided with the powers of right to rejection. So that is why, due to the flaws of the first past the post system, NOTA does not amount to right to rejection. And due to this, it has just become a protest vote only. and it does not have any electoral significance as of now. Now, the implementation of none of the above option in the elections has been implemented by the State Election Commission of Haryana in the local polls. And according to the notification by the State Election Commission of Haryana, NOTA shall be treated as a fictional electoral candidate. So if in any election, all the candidates individually receive lesser votes than the fictional electoral candidate, then none of the contesting candidates will be declared as elected and a re-election shall be held for the seat. So as we have learned in the example, if A and B candidates secure 30 and 20 votes respectively, while the none of the above option secures 50 votes, then re-elections will be held in such a scenario. Further, all the candidates who have secured less votes than the NOTA will not be eligible to refile the nomination or contest for the re-election. However, in case of re-election, if the NOTA again gets the highest votes, then further election will not be conducted and the contesting candidate with the highest votes shall be declared as elected. So for example, if the re-election is held and the candidates C and D have been fielded by the political parties, and in this vote also, the candidate C secures 20 votes, D secures 30 votes, and NOTA again secures the same number, that is 50 votes, the candidate D will be declared as the winner. So this is one of the experiments that have been done in the local elections by the State Election Commission of Haryana. So with this, let's move to the next article. Now this article on page number 8 is related to the Article 370 of the Constitution of India, which provides for special status to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And this mainly highlights the issue of, now this is related to the Constitution's 77th and 103rd Amendment Act. The first is related to the reservation in promotion for scheduled caste and scheduled tribes in the state services, and the second is related to the special provisions for the advancement of economically weaker section quota, which has recently been introduced in jobs and education. So this will form a part of the General Studies paper 2 under the topic Polity. And previously in the year 2016, a question has been asked in the mains examination related to this Article 370. Now the various aspects of the Article 370 are static in nature and can be found in standard books like M. Lakshmikant. So in this article, let us only take up the issue which has been highlighted by the author. So the background of this article is that the recently introduced Constitutional Amendment Acts of 77th and the 103rd Amendment Act of the Indian Constitution, which relate to the reservation in promotions for scheduled caste and scheduled tribes in state services and the special provisions for the advancement of economically weaker sections, or the provision which is popularly known as reservation for economically weaker section, have now been extended to the Jammu and Kashmir. And the Government of India, through the presidential orders under the Article 370, extended these Constitutional Amendment Acts of 77th and 103rd Amendment to the Jammu and Kashmir. And this was done with the concurrence of the Governor of Jammu and Kashmir. Now this introduction or the extension of these provisions was challenged in the High Court of Jammu and Kashmir. So the authors in this article have highlighted that how different presidential orders issued under the Article 370 of the Indian Constitution have diminished the special status of the Jammu and Kashmir, which has been provided in the Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. Also, the authors have raised certain legal issues with respect to the extension of constitutional provisions to the Jammu and Kashmir. Also, they have raised questions regarding whether in the absence of Jammu and Kashmir Constituent Assembly, can the provisions of the Indian Constitution be extended to Jammu and Kashmir? And secondly, whether it is appropriate to extend the presidential orders under Article 370 when the state is under governor's rule. So all the issues which have been raised by the author in this article have been provided in the PDF. So you can go through that in order to understand the issues which have been raised in this article. Now after today's discussion, let us take up practice questions. So you should try these questions from your preliminary examination point of view, and the answer for these questions will be displayed after 5 seconds. So the first question reads, consider the following statements about Mission Shakti. The first statement reads, ISRO tested the anti-satellite missile system which hit a live satellite in the low Earth orbit. Now it should be noted that this statement is incorrect because ISRO has not tested this anti-satellite missile system, but DRDO has tested this system. The second statement reads, the low Earth orbit was chosen because India does not have capability beyond that range. Now this statement is also incorrect because the low Earth orbit was chosen in order to reduce or minimize the space debris. The third statement reads, India is the fourth country in the world to have successfully tested such a system. This statement is correct. Hence, the correct answer that comes out is C, that is 3 only. The second question is pretty straightforward, and the question reads, the term Kessler's syndrome is related to. So, as we have learned in today's discussion, it is related to the problem of space debris. Further, let us take up these two practice questions from our preliminary examination point of view. The answer for these two questions will also be displayed after 5 seconds. So the first question reads, for the introduction of electoral bonds, changes have been made in which of the following acts? The first is the Income Tax Act of 1961, which is correct. Second is the Companies Act of 2013. And the third is related to the Foreign Contributions Regulations Act 2010. So the correct answer is D, that is 1, 2 and 3. The next question reads, consider the following statements about NOTA in the elections. The first statement reads, in case NOTA secures highest votes in a constituency, re-elections are held during the state legislative elections in that constituency. Now this statement is incorrect because this provision has not been introduced in the state legislative elections or even in the Lok Sabha. The second statement reads, NOTA leads to rejection of the candidates and reflects the right to reject. Now, although this reflects the right to reject, it does not lead to the rejection of candidates as of now. So that is why the correct answer will be D, that neither statement 1 nor the statement 2 are correct. So with this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now let's move to the question for the day.